The laughter in the warehouse was not subtle. It was a sharp, echoing sound that bounced off the corrugated steel walls and seemed to center directly on Arthur. He stood with his hand raised, holding up a bidding paddle that looked as worn and tired as he felt. The object of the crowd's amusement was Lot 42, a shapeless, hulking mass of metal sitting on a splintered wooden pallet in the center of the concrete floor. To the untrained eye, and even to the eyes of the seasoned scrap dealers surrounding him, it looked like a catastrophic failure of machinery, a lump of iron so caked in solidified oil, tar, and decades of filth that its original function was entirely indecipherable. The auctioneer, a man with a slick suit and a condescending sneer, had started the bidding at $100, but the silence had been deafening. When he dropped to $50, the silence persisted. It was only when he sarcastically asked if anyone would give him $20 to haul the boat anchor away that Arthur had raised his paddle. The room erupted in chuckles. The auctioneer slammed his gavel down with a theatrical flourish, mocking Arthur's investment as he shouted, "Sold!" with a tone that suggested he had just robbed the buyer. Arthur ignored the jeers. He was a man who had spent his entire life resurrecting things that the world had discarded. His hands were permanently stained with the ghost of engine oil, and his back carried the ache of 30 years under the hoods of cars. He walked over to the pallet, ignoring the scrap dealers who were already moving on to the next lot, a series of seized luxury SUVs that were the real draw of the police auction. Arthur wasn't interested in flashy plastic and modern computers. He was interested in the weight of the metal sitting before him. Even through the thick, calcified layer of sludge, he sensed a density and a shape that didn't align with the common industrial generators or truck engines usually found in these impound lots. The object was compact but incredibly heavy, and the few protrusions visible through the grime suggested a complexity that was out of place for a piece of junk. He paid his $20 at the clerk's desk, the cashier barely looking up from her phone as she processed the transaction for mesquite scrap metal. Before we dive deeper into the mystery of what Arthur actually bought, we have a huge milestone coming up. We are incredibly close to hitting 10 at our Zildjian subscribers, and we need your help to cross that finish line. If you love stories about hidden treasures and massive discoveries, please hit that subscribe button right now. Also, if you're enjoying the content, consider using the Super Thanks button to support the channel directly. It helps us keep finding these amazing stories for you. And tell us in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? We love seeing our community grow across the globe. Now, let's get back to the garage. Getting the engine out of the warehouse was a battle in itself. Arthur's truck, a rusted pickup that had seen better days, groaned under the weight as the forklift operator carelessly dropped the pallet into the bed. The suspension bottomed out with a sickening crunch, further cementing the idea in the onlookers' heads that Arthur was a fool. He drove home slowly, feeling the massive weight shifting behind him with every turn. His workshop was a small, converted barn behind his house, filled with the skeletons of old motorcycles and half-finished projects. It was a sanctuary of silence compared to the noise of the auction house. He backed the truck in, hooked up his chain hoist, and spent the next hour carefully maneuvering the greasy beast onto a heavy-duty steel workbench. Under the harsh, fluorescent lights of his shop, the engine looked even worse than it had in the warehouse. The oil had hardened into a shell, almost like a geological formation, protecting whatever lay beneath. Arthur began the process not with a wrench, but with a scraper and a heat gun. He knew that rushing this stage could damage the metal underneath. He worked methodically, softening the decades-old sludge and peeling it away in thick, black strips. The smell was pungent, a mix of ancient castor oil, burned rubber, and something metallic and sharp. As he worked his way down from the top of the block, the first anomaly appeared. He expected to find cast iron, the standard material for heavy industrial engines of the mid-20th century. Instead, as the scraper cleared a patch of the valve cover, the metal beneath gleamed with a dull, silver-gray luster. It wasn't iron. It was aluminum, but not just standard aluminum. The grain and the feel of it suggested a high-grade alloy, perhaps something mixed with magnesium for weight reduction. This was the first heartbeat of excitement Arthur felt. No one made industrial generators out of high-grade aviation alloy. He continued cleaning, moving down the side of the block. The shape that began to emerge was baffling. It wasn't an inline-6 or a V8, which were the most common configurations he encountered. The angle of the cylinder banks was wide, incredibly wide. He cleared more of the debris, revealing the mounting points for the exhaust headers. There were 12 of them. Arthur paused, his scraper hovering in the air. A V12? A V12 engine made of lightweight alloy was a rarity even in modern times, but the casting marks and the fasteners he was uncovering were clearly vintage, likely pre-1950s. The bolts were not standard hex heads. They were wired together with safety wire, a technique used in racing and aviation to prevent vibrations from loosening the screws. This was a performance engine, a high-performance engine that had been discarded, seized by the police from a drug raid on a storage unit and sold for the price of a lunch. The night wore on, and Arthur lost track of time. His coffee went cold on the bench as he became consumed by the excavation. He switched to a chemical degreaser and a stiff brush, scrubbing at the front of the engine block where the timing cover was located. This was usually where manufacturers stamped their identification. The grease here was thickest, baked on by the heat of the engine when it had last run, likely half a century ago. He scrubbed until his arms ached, the black liquid dripping onto the concrete floor. Slowly, letters began to appear in the metal. They were not stamped in a factory line. They were hand-engraved, the mark of a prototype or limited production run. The first symbol was a crest, intricate and faded, depicting a stylized winged creature. Below it, the manufacturer's script was illegible, scratched out by impact or deliberate damage. But below that, perfectly preserved in a recessed rectangle, was the serial number. Arthur wiped the area with a clean rag, leaning in close, his breath hitching in his throat. The number was simple. It didn't have the long string of digits associated with mass production. It read XPV 12/01, experimental, V12, number 1. Arthur dropped the rag. He stepped back from the bench, his heart hammering against his ribs. He knew his history. He knew about the lost engines of the 1930s, the legendary power plants built for land speed records and Grand Prix cars that had vanished during the chaos of the Second World War. If this was what he thought it was, he hadn't just bought an engine. He had found the ghost of Molsheim, Darmstadtsters, a mythical prototype developed in secret to challenge the German dominance of the Grand Prix circuit in 1939. It was an engine that was rumored to have been crated up and shipped to America to save it from the invading forces, only to disappear from the records entirely. The dealer had laughed at his $20. But as Arthur stared at the 01 stamp, he realized that the scrap metal on his bench was likely worth more than the entire warehouse he had bought it from. But with such a discovery came immediate danger. An object this valuable didn't just get lost. It was stolen, hidden, and people had likely killed for it in the past. And now it was sitting in his unprotected garage. The silence of the garage, usually a comfort to Arthur, now felt heavy and oppressive. The 01 stamped into the aluminum block seemed to pulse under the work light. A beacon that changed the atmosphere from a late-night repair session into a high-stakes standoff with history. Arthur moved quickly to the heavy wooden doors of his barn, sliding the rusted iron bolts into place and engaging the padlock he rarely used. He pulled the blinds down over the single dirty window that faced the street. The realization of what he possessed brought a sudden icy wave of paranoia. If this was indeed the legendary prototype, there were collectors who would pay millions for it, but there were also shadowy organizations that would simply take it. The engine had been missing for 80 years. Its sudden reappearance would trigger alarms in circles Arthur had no desire to enter. He returned to the workbench, his hands trembling slightly as he picked up a fiber optic borescope camera. He needed to know if the internal condition matched the external promise. He carefully removed one of the spark plugs, which came loose with a terrifying crack that echoed like a gunshot, but the threads remained intact. He fed the small camera into the cylinder. On the small, grainy monitor, a green-tinted image flickered to life. What he saw made him gasp. The cylinder walls were mirror-smooth, free of the pitting and rust that usually plagued engines left sitting for decades. The piston head was domed, a high-compression design that was decades ahead of its time for the 1930s. The engine had been preserved with a heavy, military-grade Cosmoline wax before being abandoned. Whoever had hidden this engine hadn't just dumped it, they had prepared it for a long sleep, intending to wake it up again. Arthur spent the next few hours in a trance of mechanical archaeology. He removed the valve covers, revealing a complex dual overhead cam setup that was a work of art. The gears were cut with watchmaker precision. As he cleaned more of the sludge from the side of the block, he found another marking near the flywheel housing. It was not a serial number, but a set of coordinates etched crudely into the metal with a vibro pen, followed by the initials AR. The coordinates pointed to a location in the Swiss Alps, a detail that aligned perfectly with the legends of the Ghost, fleeing occupied France in 1940. The initials likely belonged to Antoine Rinaldi, the genius engineer who had designed the car and vanished along with it. The engine wasn't just a machine. It was a message in a bottle, and Arthur was the first person to uncork it in nearly a century. The sunrise brought no sleep, only a gray light that filtered through the cracks in the barnwood. It also brought the sound of a car engine idling in his driveway. Arthur froze, his grease-stained hand hovering over a wrench. He hadn't called anyone. He peered through the gap in the blinds. A sleek, black sedan was parked next to his battered pickup truck. It was pristine, expensive, and utterly out of place in his rural neighborhood. A man in a tailored suit stepped out, scanning the property with a predatory gaze. It was the auctioneer from the warehouse, accompanied by a larger man who looked less like an appraiser and more like a bodyguard. Arthur's stomach turned. The clerical error excuse was coming. He didn't answer the door immediately. He watched as the auctioneer knocked aggressively on the front door of his small house, then turned to look at the barn. The man's phone was pressed to his ear, his body language agitated. Arthur realized the mistake he had made. He had paid with a credit card. They had his address. He grabbed a heavy breaker bar, tucking it behind the workbench, and walked to the side door of the barn, stepping out to confront them before they decided to pry the lock. The auctioneer's face lit up with a fake plastic smile the moment he saw Arthur, but his eyes remained cold and calculating. He explained, with a voice dripping with false sincerity, that there had been a terrible mistake with the paperwork for Lot 42. The engine, he claimed, was actually evidence in an active investigation and had been sold in error. He was authorized to offer Arthur a full refund plus $500 for his trouble if he loaded it into their trunk right now. Arthur played the role of the simpleton mechanic. He scratched his head, looking confused, and told them he hadn't even unloaded it from his truck yet, lying through his teeth. He claimed he had driven straight to the scrapyard and tossed it into the crusher because it was too seized up to fix. The lie hung in the air, fragile and testing. The auctioneer's smile faltered. The bodyguard stepped closer, his eyes scanning the ground for tire tracks or signs of heavy lifting. The auctioneer offered $1,000, dropping the pretense of a refund. He said the police needed the scraps for evidence. Arthur held his ground, shrugging his shoulders, insisting it was already a cube of crushed steel at the municipal yard. The auctioneer stared at him for a long, uncomfortable minute, searching for a tell. Finally, he handed Arthur a business card with a black embossed logo and no name, just a number. "If you find any pieces of it," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper, "call this number. We pay for scraps." As the black sedan reversed out of the driveway, gravel crunching under its tires, Arthur knew the clock was ticking. They didn't believe him. They would check the scrapyard, find no record of the drop-off, and they would be back. He rushed back inside the barn and locked the door again. He needed to move the engine, but it weighed nearly 600 pounds. He couldn't just throw it in the truck and run. He needed to hide it in plain sight. He looked around his shop, his eyes landing on a rusted, hollowed-out chassis of a 1970s tractor he had been using for parts. It was ugly, covered in bird droppings and hay, sitting in the corner under a tarp. It was the perfect camouflage. Using the engine hoist, he carefully lowered the priceless V12 prototype into the wide engine bay of the tractor. It was a tight fit, but with some creative angle grinding of the tractor's frame, the exotic racing engine settled into the belly of the farm equipment. He covered the shining aluminum with a dirty canvas sheet and then piled old hydraulic hoses, rusty chains, and straw on top of it, effectively burying the treasure under a layer of agricultural refuse. He had just finished concealing the serial number with a smear of fresh grease when his phone buzzed. It was a text message from an unknown number. It contained a single image, a satellite photo of his house taken from directly above with a red crosshair superimposed over his barn. The message below read, "We know you have it. Do not open the crankcase." The threat sent a chill down his spine, but it also sparked a realization. Do not open the crankcase. Why? The engine was valuable, yes, but why would they be worried about him opening the bottom end? The coordinates on the side pointed to the Alps, but the crankcase warning suggested something was inside the engine itself, something other than oil and crankshafts. Arthur looked at the tractor, at the hidden engine. He had planned to leave it alone, but the text message had the opposite effect. It confirmed that the engine was a container. He grabbed his tools. He wasn't going to wait for them to come back. He was going to find out what was worth killing for. He crawled under the tractor chassis, lying on his back in the dirt, and reached up to the oil pan bolts of the V12. He began to turn the first bolt. It was stiff, sealed with the same red wax as the spark plugs. As he loosened the bolts one by one, the heavy cast aluminum oil pan began to separate from the block. A thick, viscous, dark fluid dripped onto his chest. Not oil, but something that smelled like bitter almonds and old ink. He lowered the pan. Resting in the bottom of the oil pan, adhered to the metal with a magnetic clamp, was not a mechanical part. It was a watertight, lead-lined metal cylinder about the size of a rolling pin. It was stamped with the Nazi eagle, but someone had deeply scratched a resistance cross over the symbol. Arthur pulled the cylinder free. It was heavy. He crawled out from under the tractor and wiped the cylinder clean. The auctioneer wanted the engine, but the text message sender wanted to keep the cylinder hidden. Arthur unscrewed the cap. Inside, rolled tightly, were architectural blueprints, but they weren't for a car. They were for a bunker. And wrapped inside the blueprints was a key, a complex multi-toothed iron key that looked medieval. The engine was just the delivery system. The real treasure was whatever this key unlocked at the coordinates etched on the block. Arthur realized he wasn't just a mechanic anymore. He was now the sole keeper of a map leading to the lost vault of the Resistance, and the people coming for him were the descendants of the ones who had stolen it in the first place. Arthur did not waste a second staring at the strange iron key or the Nazi-stamped blueprints. The vibration of the phone in his pocket was the starting gun for a race he hadn't realized he was entered in. He shoved the lead cylinder, the key, and the fragile papers into a waterproof heavy-duty tool bag. He didn't return to the house. The layout of the property made the barn a trap if they blocked the driveway, but the woods behind the workshop offered a narrow, overgrown escape route. He grabbed a jerry can of gasoline and splashed a deceptive trail near the front of the barn doors, not to burn the place down, but to create an overwhelming olfactory mask that would confuse any dogs they might bring and make the intruders hesitate to use firearms or explosives near the entrance. He killed the lights, plunging the workshop into darkness, and slipped out the back service door just as the sound of multiple vehicles crunching over the gravel driveway filled the night air. He didn't take his truck. The pickup was too loud, too recognizable, and likely already tracked. Instead, Arthur ran into the dense tree line, moving with the familiarity of a man who had played in these woods as a child and hunted in them as an adult. He made his way to an old deer stand about 200 yards up the ridge, a vantage point that offered a clear, moonlit view of his property. From the darkness of the canopy, he watched the invasion unfold. It wasn't just the black sedan this time. A matte gray cargo van had joined it, sliding sideways to block the exit. 4 men spilled out of the van, moving with a tactical precision that confirmed Arthur's worst fears. These weren't scrap dealers or angry collectors. They were professionals. They wore dark clothing and carried heavy crowbars and bolt cutters, their movements synchronized and silent. Arthur watched through a pair of compact binoculars as they breached the barn. The lock he had engaged snapped like a twig under the force of their hydraulic cutter. They swarmed inside, their flashlights cutting frantic beams through the dusty air. Arthur held his breath, his eyes fixed on the corner where the rusty tractor sat. He saw the beams of light sweep over the pile of hay and hydraulic hoses covering the hood of the tractor. The light lingered for a heart-stopping second, then moved on. The disguise held. The men were looking for a gleaming, massive aluminum engine on a workbench, not a piece of farm junk rotting in the corner. The shout of frustration from inside the barn was audible even from the ridge. They had found the empty workbench, the fresh oil stains, and the scraper, but the prize was gone. They began tearing the shop apart, overturning shelves and smashing tool chests, convinced Arthur had moved the engine into a hiding spot within the walls. While they dismantled his livelihood, Arthur moved deeper into the forest. He hiked for 3 miles through the rough terrain until he reached an old logging road where he kept a backup vehicle, a battered, nondescript 1990s sedan he used for parts runs to the city, registered under a generic LLC he used for his business. The car started with a cough of blue smoke, and he drove without headlights for the first mile, navigating by the moonlight reflecting off the gravel until he hit the paved county road. He didn't head to the police. The auctioneer's involvement and the speed of their response suggested they had connections that would make a police report disappear faster than the engine. He needed neutral ground. He drove 2 hours south to a dusty, 24-hour truck stop diner that was busy enough to be anonymous, but quiet enough to think. Sitting in a corner booth with his back to the wall, Arthur finally dared to open the waterproof bag. He pushed aside his untouched coffee and unrolled the blueprints on the Formica table, using salt and pepper shakers to weigh down the curling edges of the brittle paper. The drawings were incredible, drawn with the obsessive detail characteristic of German engineering in the 1940s. They depicted a subterranean facility, labeled Festung N. The coordinates matched those etched onto the engine block. A remote, high-altitude pass in the Swiss Alps that was notorious for being impassable in winter. The facility wasn't just a bunker, it was a vault. The blueprints showed complex ventilation systems, humidity controls, and a central chamber protected by 3 distinct blast doors. But it was the mechanism of the doors that made Arthur's blood run cold. The locking mechanism detailed in the cross-section didn't use a standard tumbler or combination. It used a hydraulic pressure system that required a specific input of fluid and mechanical torque to unlock. The diagram showed a docking port that looked exactly like the flywheel housing of the V12 engine he had sitting in his tractor. The engine wasn't just a vehicle part, it was the key. The Ghost of Molsheim had been designed not just to race, but to act as a mobile, mechanical unlocking device. The car would be driven to the location, the engine coupled to the vault's intake, and the specific firing order and torque of the V12 would actuate the tumblers of the vault door. It was a lock that couldn't be picked because the key was a 600 horsepower engine that supposedly didn't exist. Arthur turned his attention to the physical iron key he had found in the cylinder. If the engine opened the outer blast doors, what was this for? He held it up to the light. The teeth were uneven, jagged, and made of a dark, meteoric iron. The head of the key was shaped like a double-headed eagle, but one head was broken off, deliberately. He consulted the blueprints again. In the center of the main vault chamber, the drawings showed a single small pedestal labeled Der Anker, the anchor. This key was for that pedestal. The vault protected something specific, something small enough to be carried by one man, but valuable enough to warrant a fortress and a custom-built engine to hide it. As he studied the papers, he noticed a margin note, handwritten in faded blue ink. It was in French, not German. Le moteur est la première porte. Le sang est la deuxième. The engine is the first door. Blood is the second. Arthur stared at the words. Blood? Did it mean a genetic lock? Unlikely for the 1940s. Or did it mean sacrifice? The mystery was darkening. He flipped the blueprint over. On the back, glued to the paper, was a small black and white photograph. It showed a group of men in lab coats standing in front of the V-12 engine, smiling. In the background, a man in a military uniform stood with his arms crossed, watching them. Arthur squinted. The officer's face was blurry, but the insignia on his collar was clear. It wasn't the SS lightning bolts. It was a symbol he didn't recognize, a circle with 3 intersecting triangles. Arthur pulled out his phone and did a reverse image search on the symbol. The results were sparse, leading to conspiracy forums and deep web history archives. The symbol belonged to the Ahnenerbe, the Nazi Ancestral Heritage Organization, but a specific splinter cell rumored to deal with occult artifacts and technology that the main regime considered too volatile. The realization hit him hard. He wasn't dealing with stolen art or gold bullion. He was dealing with something the Ahnenerbe had buried because even they were afraid to use it, or perhaps they were saving it for a Fourth Reich. The people hunting him, the auctioneer and his tactical team, were likely the modern remnants or inheritors of this splinter group. They had been waiting 80 years for the engine to resurface. He needed help. He couldn't fight a paramilitary cult alone. He thought of the only person he knew who could navigate this world, Sarah, a former university professor of European history who had been disgraced and fired for her radical theories about missing Wutu technology. She lived off the grid in a cabin near the state line, paranoid and brilliant. Arthur paid for his coffee with cash, leaving a generous tip, and gathered his dangerous cargo. As he walked to his car, he noticed a notification on his phone. The motion sensors he had installed in his barn, hidden high in the rafters and unconnected to the main security system, had triggered. He opened the app. The grainy night vision footage showed the men giving up on the walls and floor. They were now standing around the tractor. One of the men was leaning against the large rear tire, frustrated. He was smoking a cigarette. The ash fell onto the hay covering the engine. Then the man kicked the tractor's tire in anger. The impact shook the frame. The pile of hay shifted. A glint of polished aluminum reflected the flashlight beam. The man froze. He slowly reached down and brushed the hay aside. The EXP 12 01 stamp stared back at him. Arthur stopped in the parking lot, his hand gripping the door handle of his sedan. They had found it. The deception was over. They had the engine, but they didn't have the key, and they didn't have the blueprints showing where to take it or how to use it. The dynamic had shifted. They had the lock. He had the combination. And they knew who he was. They wouldn't destroy the engine. They needed it. But they would tear the world apart to find him in the cylinder. He got into the car and slammed the door. The race to the Swiss Alps hadn't just begun. It was already halfway over, and he was starting with a massive disadvantage. He had to get to Sarah, decipher the blood riddle, and figure out how to intercept a paramilitary team that was about to ship a 600-pound engine across the Atlantic. He turned the key, the old sedan roaring to life, and merged onto the highway, heading north into the darkness, leaving his old life as a simple mechanic behind forever. The drive to the state line was a blur of adrenaline and white-knuckle tension. Arthur kept to the back roads, avoiding major highways where traffic cameras might flag his license plate. His destination was a remote, heavily wooded ridge in the northern foothills, the home of Dr. Sarah Jenkins. Sarah had been a rising star in the world of academic history until her obsession with technological occultism, the specific intersection of Nazi engineering and their pseudoscientific mystical beliefs, had destroyed her credibility. She had retreated from society, barricading herself in a cabin that was more of a bunker than a home, convinced that history was not done with her. As Arthur's sedan crunched up the steep, unpaved driveway, he was met not by a porch light, but by the blinding glare of floodlights triggered by motion sensors. He stepped out of the car, slowly, raising his hands, knowing that Sarah was likely watching him through a rifle scope from the darkened window of the loft. It took a tense minute before the heavy oak door creaked open, and a voice from the shadows instructed him to come inside, alone and quickly. Sarah had not aged gracefully. The stress of her exile was etched into the lines of her face, but her eyes were sharp, intelligent, and currently filled with alarm. She didn't ask for pleasantries. She pointed to the waterproof bag in Arthur's hand. He laid the contents out on her large, cluttered dining table, pushing aside stacks of old maps and dirty coffee cups. When he unfurled the blueprints, stamped with the resistance cross and the Ahnenerbe symbol, Sarah went silent. She donned a pair of cotton gloves and picked up the heavy iron key, examining the broken double-headed eagle with a jeweler's loop. She traced the Festungen label on the map and then looked at Arthur with a mixture of terror and vindication. She told him that he had found the Rinaldi key. She explained that Antoine Rinaldi wasn't just a car designer. He was a coerced genius forced to build a vault for a splinter group of the Nazi elite who knew the war was lost as early as 1943. They called the project Operation Nibelung, a plan to hide the most dangerous esoteric technologies they had developed, weaponry that defied the physics of the time, until a future regime could rise to claim them. Sarah confirmed Arthur's theory. The V-12 engine was the physical mechanism to open the outer blast doors. The specific torque curve and firing order of the prototype acted as a sonic and mechanical combination code. But she stopped cold when she read the handwritten note. The engine is the first door. Blood is the second. She paced the room, muttering to herself, pulling books from her shelves and frantically flipping through pages. She stopped at a genealogy chart of the Rinaldi family. She explained that the Ahnenerbe were obsessed with blood memory and genetic purity. Rinaldi, to ensure the Nazis could never access the inner vault without him, had designed a biolock. The blood wasn't a metaphor for violence. It was literal. The mechanism required a sample of Rinaldi's specific genetic sequence to disengage the final failsafe. Without it, the vault would likely flood or incinerate its contents. The Nazis had killed Rinaldi in 1945 when he refused to open it, sealing the vault forever, or so they thought. The realization hit them both simultaneously. The antagonists, the organization represented by the auctioneer, had the engine. They had the first door. But they likely didn't know about the second door yet, or if they did, they were missing the key component, a Rinaldi. Sarah pointed to the chart. Antoine Rinaldi had died, but his estranged daughter had survived, smuggled out to America under a false name. Sarah had spent years tracking the lineage for her book. She tapped a name on the paper, Elena Vance. She was living in a nursing home in Vermont, oblivious to her father's legacy. But there was a younger descendant, a grandson, currently working as an architect in Zurich. His name was Julian. If the organization had done their homework as well as Sarah had, they weren't just shipping an engine to the Alps, they were hunting Julian. The air in the cabin suddenly shifted. A high-pitched electronic whine emitted from Arthur's pocket. He pulled out his phone. The screen was black, but the device was hot to the touch. Sarah snatched it from his hand and threw it into a Faraday bag, a signal-blocking pouch, on her desk, but her face told him it was too late. He had turned the phone on to check the barn cameras, and in doing so, he had pinged the nearest tower. The organization had flagged his device. Sarah immediately began killing the lights in the cabin. She moved to a wall panel and flipped a switch that activated external shutters. She grabbed a hard drive and a go bag that sat ready by the door. She told Arthur they had less than 5 minutes. The auctioneer's resources were not local police. They were private military contractors with rapid response capabilities. They exited the cabin through a concealed trap door in the pantry that led to a storm cellar, which in turn opened out into the dense forest behind the ridge. As they emerged into the cold night air, the sound of a helicopter rotor beat against the silence. A spotlight swept the clearing where the cabin stood. Arthur watched in horror as his sedan, parked in the driveway, was engulfed in a sudden fireball, a drone strike or a precision missile. The cabin was next. The organization wasn't trying to capture him anymore. They had the engine, and they likely assumed Arthur had the key. If they killed him, the key would be lost, but they might have believed they could bypass the lock with modern drilling equipment. Or more likely, they were cleaning up loose ends. Sarah led the way through the woods, moving with surprising speed. They reached a hidden garage about a mile from the main property, covered in camouflage netting. Inside was an old, reliable Land Rover. As they sped away down a logging trail, Sarah laid out the grim reality. The organization had the engine and was likely already transporting it to Switzerland via private cargo jet. They had a head start. Arthur had the physical iron key, the anchor key, and the blueprints. But neither side had the complete package. To open the vault, one needed the engine, organization has it, the iron key, Arthur has it, and the blood, Julian and Zurich. It was a three-way standoff, but the organization didn't know Arthur had the key, and Arthur didn't know if the organization had found Julian. They had to get to Zurich. They couldn't fly commercial. Their names would be on every watch list the organization could bribe their way onto. Sarah revealed she had contacts, smugglers who moved sensitive cultural artifacts across borders. They would have to take a dangerous route, a cargo ship from Halifax to Hamburg, then overland to Switzerland. It would take days. During that time, the engine would arrive at the Alps. Arthur argued that they would be too late. Sarah corrected him. The vault was designed by Rinaldi, a man who hated his captors. The installation process of the engine, the alignment, the fluid preparation. It would take weeks of engineering work to even attempt the opening. The Nazis had spent months trying and failing. The organization would be cautious. They had time, but only if they moved now. As they drove into the night, putting distance between themselves and the burning remains of Sarah's life's work, Arthur looked at the iron key in his hand. He noticed something he had missed before. In the dashboard light of the Land Rover, the broken edge of the double-headed eagle seemed to sparkle. It wasn't just broken iron. Inside the fracture, there was a tiny glass capillary tube embedded in the metal, shattered and empty. The key had contained a sample once, perhaps Rinaldi's own blood, meant to be a backup, but it was destroyed. This confirmed Sarah's fear. The biolock was active and the physical bypass was broken. They absolutely needed the grandson, Julian. The mission had changed from a treasure hunt to a rescue operation. They were racing to save a man they had never met from a group of people who would drain him dry to open a door. Sarah handed Arthur a burner phone she had pulled from her bag. She told him to memorize the face of the auctioneer, because he wasn't just a businessman. He was known in the black market as the curator, a man who specialized in recovering assets for the remnants of the old regimes. He was ruthless, efficient, and he never lost a bid. Arthur realized that he had started this by bidding $20 on a piece of scrap metal, and now the price of admission was going to be their lives. He clenched the key tight. The Land Rover disappeared onto the highway, heading north towards the Canadian border, into the shadows where they would have to live if they wanted to survive the journey to the heart of the Alps. The crossing of the Atlantic was a gray, nausea-inducing purgatory that lasted 6 days. Arthur and Sarah were not passengers on a luxury liner. They were cargo, hidden deep within the bowels of a Panamanian-flagged freighter carrying scrap metal to Rotterdam. The irony was not lost on Arthur. He was crossing the ocean surrounded by the same jagged, rusted steel that had defined his life, fleeing a conflict ignited by a single piece of engine block he had tried to save from the crusher. They spent their days in a cramped, windowless crew cabin that smelled of diesel and mildew, taking turns sleeping in 4-hour shifts while the ship pitched and rolled through the winter swells. The isolation forced a singular focus. Sarah spent the time translating the dense German footnotes on the blueprints, her face illuminated by a flickering battery-powered lantern, while Arthur disassembled and cleaned the antique iron key, learning every notch and imperfection of the object that was now their only leverage. The blueprints revealed a terrorscape of engineering designed by a paranoid genius. The vault, Festung N, was not merely a hole in the mountain, it was a machine. The tunnel leading to the inner chamber was lined with pressure sensors, calibrated to the weight of the specific transport truck used in 1940. Any deviation in weight, too heavy or too light, would trigger a collapse of the tunnel ceiling. The air inside the vault was static, sealed for 80 years. The moment the outer door opened, the sudden change in air pressure would activate a siphon system, flooding the lower chambers with glacial water unless a specific valve sequence was turned within 45 seconds. And then there was the biolock. Sarah's translation confirmed their worst fears. The interface required a direct blood transfusion into the mechanism. It was a grotesque perversion of medical technology, a vampire lock designed to ensure that only a Rinaldi could inherit the legacy. If the wrong blood type was introduced, the mechanism would incinerate the contents of the vault using a localized thermite charge. They arrived in Hamburg under the cover of a freezing rainstorm. Sarah's contact, a dock worker with missing fingers and a stoic demeanor, smuggled them off the ship in the back of a laundry van. They didn't stop to rest. They purchased train tickets to Zurich using cash, keeping their heads down, wearing nondescript coats and hats. The journey south through Germany was an exercise in paranoia. Every police officer, every security camera, every passenger who lingered too long on his phone felt like a threat. They knew the curator's reach was global. He wasn't just a rogue collector, he was part of an infrastructure that had survived the fall of the Reich, hiding in the shadows of corporate finance and private military contracting. By the time the train glided into the pristine, efficient bustle of Zurich's Hauptbahnhof, Arthur felt like a ghost haunting the modern world. Finding Julian Vance was frighteningly easy, which meant the curator had certainly found him days ago. Julian was a junior partner at a prestigious architectural firm in the city center, a man who built glass skyscrapers completely unaware that his grandfather had built the most secure dungeon in history. Sarah found his profile on the firm's website. He looked remarkably like the blurry photo of Antoine Rinaldi. The same sharp jawline, the same intensity in the eyes. He was currently overseeing a renovation project at the old opera house. Arthur and Sarah moved quickly through the city, blending into the crowd of tourists and business people. They reached the opera house plaza just past noon. It was a chaotic scene of construction fences, scaffolding, and heavy machinery. They spotted him almost immediately. Julian was standing near the entrance, wearing a white hard hat and holding a tablet, arguing with a foreman. But Arthur's eyes didn't stay on Julian. He scanned the perimeter, his instincts screaming. He saw them, 2 men in dark gray coats standing near a parked van across the street, pretending to drink coffee, but watching Julian with focused intensity. Another man was pacing near the scaffolding, talking into a wired earpiece. The trap was already set. The curator wasn't going to ask Julian for a blood sample. They were going to kidnap him. A black SUV idled at the corner, its engine running, the exhaust pluming into the cold air. The snatch and grab was imminent. Arthur grabbed Sarah's arm and pulled her behind a construction dumpster. They had no weapons, no backup, and no plan other than desperation. If the curator took Julian, the game was over. They had to get to him first, but approaching him would likely spook him or trigger the curator's men to attack. Arthur looked at the construction site. He saw a fire alarm panel on the temporary wall of the site office. It was a crude distraction, but it was all they had. He told Sarah to be ready to run. He sprinted low along the fence line, reached the panel, and smashed the glass with his elbow, yanking the lever down. The shrill, deafening alarm shrieked across the plaza. Chaos erupted. Workers dropped their tools, looking around in confusion. The foreman, shouting at Julian, turned to look at the office. In that split second of distraction, the men in the gray coats moved. They abandoned their cover, sprinting toward Julian, abandoning subtlety for speed. They were going to take him right there in the confusion. Arthur didn't think, he reacted. He vaulted the low barrier fence and tackled Julian just as the first assailant reached for him. The impact sent both Arthur and the architect sprawling into the mud. Julian shouted in shock, struggling, thinking he was being attacked by a lunatic. Arthur didn't have time to explain. He dragged Julian to his feet, shouting over the alarm that he was in danger, that the men behind him were there to kill him. Julian looked back and saw the men in gray coats pulling suppressed pistols from their jackets, no longer caring about witnesses. The sight of the weapons shattered Julian's denial instantly. He scrambled up, adrenaline taking over. Sarah appeared at the edge of the scaffolding, waving them toward a narrow alleyway that cut between the old buildings. Arthur shoved Julian toward her, placing himself between the architect and the gunman. A bullet cracked into the brickwork inches from Arthur's head, spraying dust into his eyes. He didn't flinch. He grabbed a heavy bag of cement mix from a pallet and hurled it into the path of the pursuing men, creating a cloud of dust and a stumbling block. They sprinted into the alley, the sounds of the city muffled by the narrow stone walls. The chase was on. They navigated the labyrinthine streets of Zurich's old town, taking random turns, doubling back, trying to lose the tail. Julian was hyperventilating, demanding answers, asking who they were and why people were shooting at him. Arthur pushed him into the back entrance of a crowded kitchen of a restaurant, moving through the startled cooks and out the front door onto a different street. They hailed a taxi, not waiting for it to stop fully before diving inside. Arthur threw a wad of euros at the driver and shouted for the train station, then changed his mind halfway, directing the driver to a busy shopping district instead. They needed to get off the grid, not trap themselves in a transit hub. They bailed out of the taxi in a dense crowd of shoppers and ducked into a department store, weaving through the clothing racks until they found a service exit that led to a loading dock. There, amidst the cardboard boxes and trash, the three of them collapsed, gasping for air. Julian, his expensive suit ruined, looked at Arthur with wild terror. He demanded to know what was happening. Arthur didn't speak. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the heavy iron key and the old photograph of Antoine Rinaldi. He thrust the photo into Julian's trembling hands. Julian stared at the image. He recognized the face. It was the same face he saw in the mirror every morning, the face of a grandfather he had been told died in a car accident in 1945. Sarah spoke then, her voice calm but urgent. She told him the truth. His grandfather didn't die in an accident. He was the architect of the greatest vault of the Third Reich, and he had used his own blood to seal it. She explained that the men hunting him needed him to open that seal, and once they had what was inside, they would discard him like a spent casing. Julian listened, the reality of the bullet hole in the brick wall making the insane story plausible. He looked at the key, then at the blueprint Sarah unfolded on a stack of pallets. He saw his family name on the technical drawings. The realization settled over him. He wasn't just an architect, he was a living component of a Nazi machine, but there was no time to process the trauma. Arthur checked the loading dock door. The curator's resources were vast. They would be tracking the taxi, checking street cameras. They had Julian, but they were trapped in the city. The only way out was to go where the curator was heading. They couldn't run away. They had to go to the source. The engine was already at the Alps. The curator would be waiting there, expecting his men to bring Julian. Arthur proposed a suicidal plan. They would stop running. They would go to the coordinates. They would take the fight to Festungen. They had the key, they had the blood, and they had the blueprints. If they could get into the vault before the curator's team could breach the outer doors, they could trigger the defensive systems Rinaldi had designed to destroy the contents. They wouldn't steal the treasure. They would finish Rinaldi's mission and bury it forever. The transition from the urban camouflage of Zurich to the hostile verticality of the Bernese Alps was abrupt and unforgiving. Arthur, Sarah, and Julian had traded the stolen moments of the city for a rented, battered Land Rover equipped with snow chains, driving straight into the teeth of a brewing blizzard. The blueprints provided the route, but the terrain fought them every inch of the way. The coordinates for Festungen pointed to a location that officially didn't exist on modern maps, a blind spot in the cartography caused by magnetic anomalies that interfered with early survey equipment, likely an intentional geological camouflage chosen by the Ahnenerbe. As the air thinned and the temperature plummeted well below freezing, the reality of their mission settled heavily in the cabin of the vehicle. Julian sat in the back, staring at his arm, where Sarah had improvised a sterile kit for the blood transfer. He wasn't just a passenger, he was the key, and the weight of his grandfather's dark legacy was visibly crushing him. They abandoned the vehicle 3 miles from the target site, where the road dissolved into an impassable wall of ice and scree. The wind howled through the pass, a physical force that stung their exposed skin. Sarah led the way, navigating by a combination of the crumbling 1940s topography on the blueprints and a handheld GPS that flickered in and out of service. They weren't approaching the front door. The curator would have that locked down with a perimeter of armed guards and thermal optics. They were looking for a needle's eye. A construction ventilation shaft marked on the original schematics as a temporary exhaust port for the diesel generators used during the excavation, which Rinaldi had ordered sealed with loose rock rather than concrete, leaving a deliberate vulnerability that only he knew about. After an hour of grueling climbing, they crested a ridge and froze. Below them, carved into the sheer granite face of a hanging valley, was the entrance to Festung Inn. It was a terrifying fusion of nature and industrial brutalism. A massive concrete archway, stained with 80 years of mineral runoff, framed a blast door the size of a townhouse. But it wasn't the architecture that stopped Arthur's heart. It was the activity. The curator had turned the desolate mountain pass into a forward operating base. High-intensity floodlights bathed the snow in blinding white light. A heavy-lift helicopter sat on a leveled pad of snow. And there, right in front of the massive blast door, was the V-12 engine. It had been mounted onto a heavy steel frame, bolted directly into the rock floor. A complex array of hydraulic hoses and drive shafts connected the engine's flywheel to a protruding docking port in the center of the blast door. It looked less like a car engine and more like a mechanical heart being transplanted into a stone giant. Technicians in white clean suits were swarming around it, pouring fluids into the intake and checking monitors. They were preparing to fire it up. The sound of shouting voices drifted up on the wind, sharp and commanding. The curator was down there, pacing in a thick, fur-lined coat, checking his watch. They were behind schedule, likely struggling with the fuel mixture for the temperamental prototype. Arthur signaled for them to move. They slid down the backside of the ridge, away from the lights, finding the depression in the rock that marked the ventilation shaft. It was buried under feet of snow, but Arthur dug frantically with a collapsible shovel until his blade hit rusted iron grates. They pried the bars loose. The metal was brittle from decades of cold and slipped into the darkness of the mountain one by one. The silence inside was instant and suffocating. The air was stale, smelling of ozone and dead earth. They switched on their tactical flashlights, the beams cutting through dust that hadn't been disturbed since the Truman administration. The shaft was narrow, forcing them to crawl on their hands and knees over jagged rocks and rusted debris. They crawled for what felt like miles, the tunnel sloping sharply downward, taking them deep into the mountain's core. Sarah whispered that they were passing over the crush zone, the tunnel section rigged to collapse if the weight sensors were triggered. They were bypassing the outer defenses entirely. Finally, the tunnel widened into a maintenance corridor lined with decaying electrical cables. They were inside. The temperature here was constant, hovering just above freezing. They moved silently toward the central chamber, guided by the vibrations resonating through the stone floor. The engine outside was being cranked. The low, rhythmic chug-chug-chug of the starter motor echoed through the walls like a heartbeat. They reached a heavy iron door with a small viewing slat. Arthur peered through. They were looking into the antechamber, the space between the outer blast door and the inner vault. It was a massive cavern reinforced with steel beams. The back of the giant blast door was visible, a complex mechanism of gears and tumblers the size of wagon wheels. And directly in front of them, across the cavern floor, was the second door, the biolock. It was smaller, made of polished stainless steel that hadn't tarnished in 80 years. In the center was a glass cylinder with a needle interface, glowing with a faint amber luminescence powered by some dying internal battery or geothermal source. This was where Julian had to go. Suddenly, a thunderous roar shook the dust from the ceiling. The V-12 engine outside had caught fire. The sound was not the smooth purr of a modern car. It was a violent, jagged scream of raw power, amplified by the acoustics of the valley and transmitted through the steel door. The 1930s racing engine, running on high-octane aviation fuel, was spinning at thousands of revolutions per minute. The gears on the back of the blast door began to turn. The groan of metal on metal was deafening. The curator had successfully synchronized the engine. The outer door was opening. Arthur realized they had seconds. Once the outer door opened, the curator's team would flood into this antechamber. They would see the heroes, and they would have nowhere to run. But the opening of the door also offered a chaotic opportunity. The pressure equalization system Rinaldi designed kicked in. As the seal on the outer door broke, a massive gust of wind roared through the antechamber, sucking dust and debris out toward the entrance. Arthur kicked the maintenance door open, and they sprinted across the open floor of the antechamber, using the noise of the screaming engine to mask their footsteps. They needed to reach the biolock before the outer door opened fully enough to admit the curator's troops. They reached the stainless steel door. It was seamlessly integrated into the rock. The interface was terrifyingly simple. A single armrest with a restraint strap and the glass cylinder. Julian looked at Arthur, his eyes wide with fear, but he didn't hesitate. He rolled up his sleeve. The roar of the V-12 was getting louder, the gap in the main door widening to a few feet. Flashlight beams from the outside began to cut into the darkness of the room. They were spotted. A shout rang out over the engine noise. Not a command to stop, but a cry of surprise. Bullets sparked against the stone floor near their feet. The curator's advance guard was firing blindly through the opening gap. Arthur shoved Julian into the alcove of the biolock, using his own body as a shield. Sarah grabbed the heavy iron key, the anchor key, and jammed it into a secondary slot beneath the blood interface. The key turned with a heavy clunk, priming the system. The amber light turned red. The machine was awake and demanding its toll. Julian thrust his arm into the mechanism. The restraint strap snapped shut automatically, locking his arm in place. A mechanical hiss followed and the needle descended. Julian screamed, a sound that was swallowed by the mechanical cacophony around them. The glass cylinder began to fill with bright red blood, drawn at an alarming speed. The outer door was now half open. The curator himself stepped through the gap, flanked by mercenaries with assault rifles. He saw them. He didn't look angry, he looked ecstatic. He saw the grandson of Rinaldi opening the door for him. He signaled his men to hold fire. Why kill the goose that was laying the golden egg? He began to walk calmly across the antechamber, his boots clicking on the stone, shouting for them to step aside once the door opened. He thought they were cornered rats doing his work for him. Arthur looked at the biolock. The blood level hit a marked line. The red light flashed green. A heavy series of latches disengaged deep within the wall. The inner vault door hissed, the vacuum seal breaking with a sound like a cracking whip. Arthur grabbed Julian, whose face was pale and drained, and yanked him free as the restraint released. The inner door swung inward, revealing absolute darkness. Arthur didn't step aside for the curator. He pulled Sarah and Julian into the darkness of the vault with him, and hit the internal emergency seal button on the other side. The stainless steel door slammed shut in the curator's face, sealing them inside the mountain's heart. They were safe from the guns, but they were now trapped in a sealed box with limited air, and they had just locked themselves in with the very thing the Nazis had been too afraid to keep. The silence returned, absolute and terrifying, broken only by the heavy breathing of 3 people who had just buried themselves alive. The darkness inside the vault did not last. As the stainless steel door sealed with a final hydraulic hiss, banks of overhead fluorescent tubes flickered to life, one by one, reacting to the sudden change in air pressure. The light was harsh, clinical, and humming, with the sound of 80-year-old ballasts. Arthur, Sarah, and Julian stood frozen, their eyes adjusting to the glare, expecting to see piles of gold bars or crates of stolen masterpieces. What they saw instead was a laboratory. The room was circular, carved directly into the granite and lined with workbenches covered in dust sheets. But the center of the room was dominated by a single object that defied explanation. It sat on a raised dais, encased in a thick lead-glass sphere. Inside the glass, suspended by a magnetic field that was still faintly active, was Der Anchor, the anchor. It wasn't a weapon in the traditional sense, nor was it a simple machine. It was a gyroscope of impossible complexity, a sphere of dark, matte metal about the size of a basketball, etched with glowing runic circuitry that pulsed with a slow, rhythmic heartbeat of violet light. It was spinning silently, hovering in the vacuum of its casing. Sarah gasped, stepping forward, her hand covering her mouth. She recognized it from the deepest, most discredited whispers of the Ahnenerbe archives. This was the Glocke prototype's stabilizer, a device designed to manipulate local gravity fields for the proposed vertical takeoff craft the Nazis had desperately tried to build in 1945. It was a power source of infinite instability, capable of bending physics, or, if mishandled, cracking the mountain in half like an egg. Arthur didn't care about the physics. He cared about the tactical reality. He walked to the workbenches. They were littered with skeletal remains, not human, but mechanical. Half-built prototypes, blueprints, and tools lay where they had been dropped. This wasn't just a storage locker, it was a tomb for failed science. Julian, pale and clutching his bandaged arm, leaned against a console. "My grandfather built this," he whispered, staring at the terrifyingly beautiful spinning object. "He didn't just build it," Sarah corrected, reading the gauges on the console. "He trapped it. Look at the readouts. The device isn't dormant. It's in a containment loop. If the magnetic field fails, that thing accelerates until it tears itself apart." The V-12 engine outside. It's not just a key to open the door. It's a harmonic dampener. The curator is trying to synchronize the engine's vibration with this, to stabilize it so he can move it. The realization hit Arthur with the force of a physical blow. The curator wasn't just trying to steal a relic. He was trying to extract a live singularity. If he breached the door without the proper containment sequence, The sudden change in atmospheric pressure combined with the interruption of the magnetic field would cause a catastrophic energy discharge. They weren't just trapped in a vault, they were trapped inside a bomb that was about to go off. Suddenly, the heavy steel door behind them groaned. A high-pitched screaming sound drilled through the metal. The curator was using a thermal lance. Sparks began to shower from the top hinge, molten metal dripping onto the floor. He wasn't waiting for the engine to unlock it anymore. He was cutting his way in, impatient and reckless. The heat radiating from the door was already raising the temperature in the sealed room. "We need to kill it," Arthur said, his voice hard. "We can't let him take it, and we can't let it detonate." He looked at the iron key in his hand, the anchor key. He ran to the central dais. There was a keyhole at the base of the lead-glass sphere labeled Notabschaltung, emergency shutdown. "Sarah, if I turn this, what happens?" he shouted over the noise of the drilling. Sarah frantically translated the placard. "It scuttles the mechanism. It breaks the vacuum and drops the core into the disposal shaft below. It flushes it into the glacial runoff." "And where does that shaft go?" Arthur asked. "To the valley floor. But the drop is hundreds of feet. It will destroy the device." "Good," Arthur growled. "Does the shaft have a maintenance ladder?" Sarah checked the blueprints she was still clutching. Her eyes widened. "Yes, but it's a sluice gate. If you open it, the glacial meltwater from the reservoir above will flood this chamber to cool the reactor. We'll be washed out with it." "Better than being shot or vaporized," Arthur said. He looked at Julian. "Can you move?" Julian nodded, adrenaline fighting through the blood loss. "Do it." Arthur jammed the jagged iron key into the slot at the base of the dais. It wouldn't turn. The mechanism was seized with age. The drilling at the door was getting louder. A glowing orange line was cutting through the steel. They had seconds before the curator's men kicked the door in. Arthur grabbed a heavy wrench from a nearby workbench. He didn't use finesse. He used the leverage of a mechanic who had spent 30 years breaking rusted bolts on farm trucks. He fitted the wrench over the head of the key and heaved with everything he had. Snap! The sound echoed like a gunshot. The key turned, but the internal mechanism shattered. A klaxon began to blare, a harsh mechanical sound that drowned out the drill. The violet light in the spinning sphere turned an angry, pulsating red. The magnetic field died instantly. The heavy metal sphere dropped from its suspension, crashing through the glass floor of the containment unit and disappearing into the dark abyss of the disposal chute below. A massive shudder ran through the mountain. The device was gone, falling into the depths to be crushed by the earth. But the sequence Arthur had triggered wasn't finished. A series of explosive bolts fired around the perimeter of the room's ceiling. The cooling system engaged. It wasn't a gentle sprinkler. It was a deluge. A torrent of freezing near-0-degree glacial water exploded into the room from high-pressure vents. The force of the water knocked Sarah off her feet. Arthur grabbed her, hauling her up. The water level was rising instantly, swirling around their knees, then their waists. The thermal lance cut through the main door with a final hiss, and the steel slab fell inward with a crash, landing in the rising water. The curator stood in the doorway, framed by the blinding work lights from the antechamber. He looked at the empty dais, then at the rising water, and his face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He raised a heavy pistol, aiming directly at Arthur. "You ruinous peasant!" he screamed, the veneer of the sophisticated businessman vanishing completely. He fired. The bullet struck the water inches from Arthur's chest. Arthur didn't return fire. He didn't have a gun. Instead, he grabbed the heavy cast-iron control lever for the disposal sluice, the drain, and yanked it open. The floor beneath the dais opened up like an iris. The water, now waist-deep and churning, created a massive vortex, sucking everything in the room toward the central hole. "Jump!" Arthur screamed, shoving Julian toward the center. Julian vanished into the swirling black water. Sarah went next, taking a deep breath and letting the current take her. Arthur looked back at the door one last time. The curator was wading into the room, fighting the current, trying to reach them, his gun raised. But the water was too powerful. A wall of freezing sludge hit the curator, knocking him off his feet and sweeping him against the metal workbenches. Arthur turned and dove into the vortex. The sensation was terrifying. A chaotic, freezing slide through a smooth stone tube in total darkness. He was battered against the walls, holding his breath until his lungs burned. He was spinning, tumbling, the water acting as a cushion and a battering ram. He felt the sensation of falling, a stomach-churning drop, and then impact. He hit deep water, not the claustrophobic tube, but a wide, open expanse. The shock of the cold was paralyzed. He kicked frantically, his heavy boots dragging him down. He saw a faint light above him and swam for it, breaking the surface with a gasp that was half scream. He was in the discharge pool at the base of the waterfall, miles below the entrance. The moon was shining on the water. He looked around. Julian was clinging to a rock near the bank, coughing up water. Sarah was dragging herself onto the pebbled shore a few yards away. They had survived the flush. Arthur swam to the shore, his limbs numb, shivering violently. He dragged himself onto the frozen mud, collapsing on his back, staring up at the mountain. High above, near the peak, a muffled explosion rumbled. A plume of snow and rock cascaded down the cliff face. The vibrations of the undampened V-12 engine, combined with the structural damage of the water release, had collapsed the tunnel. Festung N was sealed again, this time permanently. Arthur sat up, his teeth chattering. He looked at the waterfall pool. There was no sign of the sphere. The anchor was buried under tons of rock at the bottom of the lake, or perhaps it had shattered on impact. It didn't matter. It was gone. And the curator? The tunnel collapse would have buried the upper chamber. If he hadn't been washed down the drain with them, he was entombed with his prize. Is it over? Julian asked, his voice weak. Arthur looked at his hands. They were raw, bleeding, and still stained with the grease of the V-12 engine he had bought for $20. He reached into his pocket. He still had the handle of the broken iron key. The auction is closed, Arthur said, tossing the broken iron into the lake. But as they sat there, freezing and alive, a sound cut through the wind. Not the sound of a helicopter or a siren. It was the sound of a phone ringing. Not Arthur's phone. His was destroyed. It was coming from Sarah's waterproof bag. She opened it with trembling hands. It was the burner phone she had used to contact the smugglers. She answered it, putting it on speaker. A voice crackled through the static. It was calm, synthetic, and distorted. Item 001, destroyed. Secondary objective failed. However, the biometric data from the grandson has been successfully transmitted to the server before the link was severed. Thank you for your cooperation, Mr. Vance. Phase 2 can now begin. The line went dead. Arthur, Sarah, and Julian looked at each other in the moonlight. The curator might have been the face of the operation, but he wasn't the head. The machine inside the vault had scanned Julian's blood before the door opened. The data had been beamed out. The organization didn't need the physical vault anymore. They had the genetic sequence required to recreate the technology. The engine was gone. The sphere was gone, but the knowledge had escaped. They have the code, Sarah whispered. They can build another one. Arthur stood up, wringing the freezing water from his coat. The shivering wasn't just from the cold anymore. Then we have work to do, he said, looking at the dark road leading out of the valley, because I'm not letting them build an engine I can't fix. The escape from the Bernese Alps was a grueling test of endurance that blurred the line between survival and nightmare. Wet, freezing, and suffering from hypothermia, Arthur, Sarah, and Julian were eventually picked up by a local contact Sarah had arranged, a weather-beaten smuggling pilot who operated a cargo helicopter out of a private airfield near Interlaken. They flew low through the valleys to avoid radar, watching the sunrise illuminate the peaks where they had just buried a piece of history that should never have existed. The destruction of the vault at Festung N had been registered by geological sensors as a minor seismic event, a convenient cover story that would shield the truth of the collapse from the public eye. To the world, it was an avalanche. To the organization, it was a tactical setback. To Arthur, it was the end of his life as a simple mechanic and the beginning of something far more complex. They did not return to the United States immediately. The risk was too high. Arthur's home was a scorched ruin, his shop destroyed, and his identity likely flagged by every corrupt agency on the curator's payroll. Instead, they retreated to a safe house in the Azores, a remote coastal property owned by one of Julian's shell companies. There, amidst the crashing Atlantic waves and the isolation of the island, they began to process the aftermath. The burner phone call had changed everything. The organization, now identified as the Anchor, possessed Julian's biometric data. They couldn't open the old vault, but they now had the genetic key to engineer new locks, or worse, to activate other dormant technologies Rinaldi had hidden across Europe. The V-12 engine was gone, but the war it had started was just entering its second phase. However, the destruction of the vault yielded an unexpected financial reality. Julian, having fully accepted his lineage, utilized the downtime to explore the financial legacy of the Rinaldi family. The blueprints Arthur had saved contained more than just engineering schematics. In the margins of the final page, Sarah discovered a series of alphanumeric codes. They were not launch codes, but account keys for a series of blind trusts established in Liechtenstein in 1944. Antoine Rinaldi had not just hidden a machine. He had hidden the funding intended for the Fourth Reich, stealing it from his captors to ensure they couldn't rebuild. With Julian's biometric verification and the physical codes from the blueprints, the accounts were unlocked. The dormant assets, compounding interest for 80 years, amounted to a staggering sum. Julian did not keep this fortune for himself. He recognized that his life was owed entirely to the mechanic who had bid $20 on a piece of scrap. He executed a massive, untraceable transfer to a new offshore entity controlled by Arthur. The payment was classified as a consulting fee for historical recovery, totaling $15, $5 million USD. The mechanic, who had scraped pennies to keep his lights on, was now independently wealthy, possessing the resources to rival the very organization hunting them. But Arthur wasn't interested in retirement. He didn't buy a yacht or a mansion. He bought a fortress. 6 months later, in a vast, repurposed industrial hangar in the Nevada desert, miles from the prying eyes of the city, Arthur stood on a metal gantry overlooking his new domain. The facility was state-of-the-art, equipped with 5-axis CNC machines, advanced metallurgy labs, and a secure server room run by Sarah, who had now dedicated her life to tracking the anchor's digital footprint. The floor was filled with vehicles, but not customer cars. There were armored transport trucks being retrofitted with reinforced chassis, high-speed pursuit vehicles with engine modifications that defied factory specs, and specialized excavation equipment. Arthur had not built a repair shop. He had built a war room for mechanical warfare. Julian, now living under a new identity and acting as the team's financier and architectural strategist, walked up the stairs to join him. He handed Arthur a tablet. The screen displayed a grainy satellite image of a shipping facility in the South China Sea. Thermal imaging showed a heat signature that matched the unique, high-temperature exhaust profile of a V-12 engine. Not the original 1930s prototype, but a modern replication. The organization had successfully reverse-engineered the Ghost of Molsheim design using the data they had stolen. They were building a new key for a different lock, likely another vault located in the Pacific Theater. They're moving the new prototype next week, Julian said, his voice hard and determined. Do we have the transport ready? Arthur wiped his hands on a rag, a habit he would never break, no matter how much money he had in the bank. He looked down at the workshop floor where a massive, matte black heavy hauler truck sat idling. The hood was open, revealing an engine that Arthur had built himself from scratch, applying the lost principles of the Rinaldi Visen 12 he had studied in the Alps. It was a monster of torque and horsepower, designed to intercept, ram, and disable any convoy the anchor could put on the road. The truck is ready, Arthur replied, a small, dangerous smile playing on his lips. And this time, we're not bidding on the engine. We're taking it. The journey that began with a humiliating laugh at a police auction had transformed Arthur into the guardian of lost history. He realized that the world was full of Lot 42s, objects of immense power disguised as junk, waiting for someone with the eye to see them and the hands to fix them. The auctioneer was dead, but the buyers were still out there, and as long as they were hunting for the past, Arthur would be there to ensure they never owned the future. He tossed the oily rag into a bin and walked toward the truck. The engine roared to life, a sound of pure, unadulterated power that shook the hangar walls. The $20 engine was gone, but the mechanic was just getting started. Thanks for watching this incredible story. If you want to see what happens in Phase 2, make sure you're subscribed, because the hunt is far from over.